naturalism as a way of explaining things has continued fairly aggressively for 4 centuries, and I think will continue to for many more centuries, and such that we'll be left with the question is, what is there left for God to do? And so I think just 2 points on that is that, one, although I can't prove a negative, I can demonstrate fairly conclusively, I think, that belief in God and the kind of God you believe in and the sorts of religions you adhere to depend very much on where you happen to have been born and in which century you happen to have been born. So if you were born 10,000 years ago or 200 years ago or 500 years from now, is very much going to shape what particular God you believe in. And so that alone tells us that there's a strong cultural component and historical component to just the concept of God. And there's nothing particularly unusual about creation myths. All cultures have them. There's nothing, then there's something. Or else it wouldn't be a creation story, would it? And most cultures have flood myths, especially cultures that are on bodies of water that flood. Lots of cultures have resurrection stories and virgin birth stories. Dionysus, a Greek god of wine, converted water into wine, drank the body and blood of the creator of the universe, and Osiris, the Egyptian god, way predating Judeo-Christian gods, had a kind of a resurrection and savior story, such that first, if the pharaoh believes in Osiris, he gets everlasting life. Then the pharaohs figured out you can employ people to build pyramids much better if you give them the promise of the afterlife also, and that expanded into basically accepting a savior-type person to achieve everlasting life. So we see that happening everywhere we go. And then the second point, just to wrap it up, is that what we know from neuroscience is that we do tend to look at the world and find meaningful patterns and impose on those patterns intentional agency. And so the intentional agents are things like ghosts and gods and demons and angels and aliens and so forth. And God is another version of that. It's a projection of what our brain is doing to try to understand and make sense of the world. And all of that together, I think, is a strong several lines of evidence to show us that we created God and not vice versa.
Thank you, Michael. Deepak.
I just want to correct a few inaccuracies. I have met Michael before, but it was in a previous lifetime. Okay. Secondly, I also want to reinforce that we, along with what Michael said, that I'm not here to talk about belief. I think belief is a cover-up of insecurity. You only believe in things that you don't know the truth of, and you want to know the truth of. If I asked you, do you believe in electricity or electromagnetism, you would say, what kind of a ridiculous question is that? If you want to know the truth, you must have the experience, you must have a theoretical basis, and you must have the rules of science to either falsify what you're saying, that means experimentally prove it, or at least submit to what is called Occam's principle, the theory of parsimony, that the simplest explanations are the best explanations. So I'm not here to defend the God of primitive theology, which Michael Shermer has talked about. I'm not here to defend Osiris, although Jean can speak to that. I'm not here to defend Dionysus, although when he was speaking, I had the feeling that I was Dionysus once, and because I'm a reformed wine lover. Now, here's the gist of what I want to say today. We are here not to argue the validity of science. Science is the most impeccable way of understanding the rules, the laws of nature. A science that has brought us the rules of mathematics, physics, chemistry, cosmology, evolution. So we're not going to argue about that. It's irrelevant. What we're going to say is that we are here to upgrade science so that we can look at a deeper level of reality where we find an infinite intelligence and infinite consciousness that explains to some extent the Big Bang, cosmogenesis, what is called autopoiesis, which is the formation of life from inanimate matter, and Darwinian evolution, which is about gene variation and natural selection, We are here to see how that very science can upgrade our view of theology, which is why we are calling this the future of God, and upgrading both of science and of theology that looks at God as an infinite consciousness, that looks at God as the agent of downward causation, that looks at God as the author of the Big Bang, and the first 10 to the power of minus 43 seconds of creation, which is 10 followed by a tenth of a million seconds, of which science has to say that this segment of creation is not only unknown but unknowable, because the laws of physics fail there. They disintegrate. There are no laws to speak of. And once that phase is over, 10 to the power of minus 43, then we have actually very reasonable principles of mathematics, of physics, that explain how primordial gases turn into heavy elements, and how there was the birth of carbon and hydrogen and nitrogen, and how the exact constants of creation. There are about 20 mathematical constants that are arbitrarily assigned to the laws of physics. They have no reason to be there. They are arbitrarily given, but once they are there, you can explain all of cosmogenesis. No one knows how life came from inanimate matter. Maybe one day they'll know, but once it came, then the principles of evolution apply.
We're at 3 minutes.
Done.
Okay.
Well, I think as you've begun to hear, there are two very different kinds of conversations we could have here. We can talk about religion as it is, for most people most of the time, and we can talk about what religion could be, or should be, or perhaps what it is for the tiniest minority of people. And I just want you to be aware of the difference there, because it could get lost. It's true that some people define God as pure consciousness, or as being synonymous with the laws of nature. But if we talk about consciousness and the laws of nature, we won't be talking about the God that most of our neighbors believe in, which is a personal God who hears our prayers and occasionally answers them. So I just want you to be sensitive to this, because if Michael or I say something derogatory about Islam or Christianity, which seems possible, the response from the other side shouldn't mention quantum mechanics. And it shouldn't reference a notion of God that is so denuded of doctrine as to more or less be synonymous with pure mystery or pure information or pure energy or pure anything. So I wanted to plant a flag there where you all can see it, because the God that our neighbors believe in is essentially an invisible person. He is a creator deity who created the universe to have a relationship with one species of primate. Lucky us. and he's got galaxy upon galaxy to attend to, but he's especially concerned with what we do, and he's especially concerned with what we do while naked. And he almost certainly disapproves of homosexuality. And he's created this cosmos as a vast laboratory in which to test our powers of credulity. And the test is this: can you believe in this God on bad evidence? Which is to say, on faith. And if you can, you will win an eternity of happiness after you die. And it's precisely this sort of God and this sort of scheme that you must believe in if you're going to have any kind of future in politics in this country. No matter what your gifts. I mean, you could be an unprecedented genius. You could look like George Clooney. You could have $1 billion, and you could have the social skills of Oprah, and you are going nowhere in politics in this country unless you believe in that sort of God. So we can talk about anything we want. I'm happy to talk about consciousness, but please notice that when we migrate away from the God that is really shaping human events,
or the God talk that is really shaping human events in our world at this moment.
Start with you, Deepak. What scientific proof or evidence of any sort can you muster to support your assertion that there is, for lack of a better term, God or some sort of intelligence at the heart of the universe?
Before I answer that, I think I want to say something, address something that Sam Harris said. He said God is very concerned about what we're doing naked. Well, what we're doing naked is the very mechanics of creation. So we don't have to be embarrassed about sometimes, at least now, yes, sometimes. Okay, what scientific proof? I think science is, and again, in deference to Sam Harris, he said, don't go the way of quantum physics. I think I'm going to have to say that science is now in a process of overthrowing the climactic overthrow of the superstition of materialism. That everything that we call matter comes from something that is not material. That the essential nature of the physical world is that it's not physical. That the essential stuff of the universe is non-stuff. Call it what you will. And science also tells us, and if there are any scientists who want to disagree with them, please come up during the question and answer session. Science tells us that nature is a discontinuity, that it's an on-off phenomenon, that there are gaps between every two ons, where you find a field of possibilities, a field of pure potentiality. Science doesn't call it God, but what is God if not the immeasurable potential of all that was, all that is, and all that will be? Science also tells us that this is a field of non-locality, where everything is correlated with everything else. My adversaries are going to point out, no, everything, God is explained by neurology. Well, I hope today, Michael, that you will convert from a skeptic to a neuroskeptic, because your science is really frozen in the dungeons of conservatism and in the dungeons of orthodoxy. Today, science tells us that the essential nature of reality is non-local correlation. Everything is connected to everything else. That there's hidden creativity, there are quantum leaps of creativity, that there's something called the observer effect, where intention orchestrates space-time events, which we then measure as movement and motion and energy and matter. And addressing Sam, we can have a personal relationship with this intelligence, because we have a consciousness that is part of the sea of consciousness. Rumi, the great Sufi poet, said, you're not just a drop in the ocean, you're the mighty ocean in the drop. And all you have to do is understand the principles of science and understand that you have within you the resources to intuitively grasp this mystery. But one of the things we have to do today...
Did you hear anything in there that convinces you?
You asked, Dan, what I meant by woo-woo. That is the very embodiment of woo-woo. He said, stringing together at a rapid patter of a bunch of scientific-sounding words sprinkled in with some spiritual New Age words doesn't mean anything. I mean, just take one example of this non-local quantum effects. We're all connected. No, this is not true. When quantum physicists talk about non-locality and the interconnectedness of things, they're talking about things at the quantum level.
Wait, well, let me just stop you for a second, because I will play the dummy tonight, because it's not a hard role for me to assume. What does non-local mean? I mean, I kind of understand what quantum physics means, but just give it to me really simply.
Okay. There's this very simple two-slit experiment where you fire these photons through, and if you just have two streams of light, they form a little interference wave pattern, like throwing two rocks in a pond.
You've already confused.
Okay, and so it. Yeah, you want to interrupt?
He's getting into the woo-woo now.
No, this is just you. Okay, what he means by
guys with woo-woo.
What he means by non-local. What he means by non-local is that everything in the universe is interconnected, and it just is not true. It just isn't.
And there's no reason to think that it's active at the level of the brain. That non-locality is a principle that is working. But hold on, Deepak, you spoke for quite some time. The deeper point to make here, and what is...
But I want to address that brain thing that you just said.
Okay, no, but you might not have to, because The deeper point here, and this is where the whole style and content of what you're saying is so deeply unscientific, is that there's not a physicist sitting on this stage right now. Okay, I would never be tempted to lecture a room full of 1,000 people at Caltech about physics. I'm not a physicist. You're not a physicist. And basically every sentence demonstrates that you speak on the subject. Now, please don't take this as ad hominem. I mean, I'm talking about specifically what you said. But the fact, what you do and what many people who try to invoke spooky physics do in the service of propping up their religious and New Age intuitions is that they think that because what you're saying, because quantum mechanics is spooky and difficult to understand, and because what you're saying is spooky and difficult to understand, they must somehow be related, or they must somehow be mutually supportive. And that's fundamentally not true. They are arrived at by completely different methodologies and ways of thinking and criteria of discursive evidence. What a mystic, I've studied with great mystics. I've met great meditation masters who've spent 20 years in caves perfecting the kinds of techniques of meditation that you would adopt or recommend. They don't know a damn thing about physics. And they're not interested, for the most part, in physics. I mean, there's nothing about sitting in a cave and granted, having incredibly useful and even normative experiences and transforming your way of life and transforming your moment-to-moment perception of the world. There's nothing about that project that makes you a theoretical physicist. And so these are completely different language games. They're completely, and you have just merge them together in a very unprincipled way, and you're getting away with it.
No, I take resentment at your questioning my scientific credentials. In fact, if anyone on this stage is more scientifically credentialed, it's me. I took physics, chemistry, biology. I'm an MD. I'm a neuroendocrinologist, and I want to object to your saying that brain does not obey non-locality. When you're thinking right now, 100 trillion neurons are phase locking and frequency locking in simultaneously. Is that non-locality or not?
Okay, can I just have...
I just want to quote from Einstein: "Science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind." From Stephen Hawking: "It would be very difficult to explain why the universe would have begun in just this way, except as the act of a God who intended to create beings like us."
But Hawking's an atheist.
Please
look
up those.
This is a direct quote.
So what? Hawking has stated on this very stage, he does not believe in God.
Why, he doesn't believe in the dead white male that you're talking about, the straw man that you have put up, or the mythical God that Sam Harris is talking about.
The God you put up is a meaningless, non-local God.
No, I just said, this is also the God that gives us inspiration, insight, creativity, free will, conscious choice making, imagination. Are your neurons doing that, or are you doing that?
As just a point of process here,
well,
could you dial it down just a little bit? First of all, I invite everyone to look up that Einstein quote in Ideas and Opinions, read it in context. It'll be absolutely obvious. It can't be pressed into the service that you just witnessed. Einstein complained about this treatment of his metaphorical use of the word God and the few things he said about religion, and you can look that up in Richard Dawkins' book. This is a game, and it's a game that is designed for export to people who don't know much science and don't know how science is done. And you missed the point I wasn't criticizing your scientific credentials. You're an endocrinologist. You're an MD. You're not a theoretical physicist. The way science is done is
when theoretical physicists in this audience to actually address these questions.
Okay, so a theoretical physicist will be comfortable talking with real confidence in a very narrow band of his expertise, and he will be exquisitely sensitive to the fact that when he's in a room like this, or she, sorry. I'll just proceed with he just for simplicity's sake here. he will be exquisitely sensitive to the fact that whenever he opens his mouth in a room like this, he is guaranteed to be speaking in front of half a dozen people who know more on any given issue than he does. The great irony of the popular conception of science as arrogant is that when you go to a scientific meeting, you don't see arrogance. I mean, you're about as likely to see real arrogance as you're likely to see nudity at a scientific conference. I mean, this is people are constantly offering caveats and hedges toward what they say. Every statement is couched in, I'm sure there's someone in the room who knows more about this than me, but because everyone is desperate to avoid public embarrassment. Now, this seems to be something you're not doing.
If I was worried about being embarrassed, I wouldn't be actually influencing the people that I'm influencing. And I can also say something right now is that I agree that, science is about a very specific methodology, but for people like Michael, not you so much, but people like Michael, to take all of inner experience, all of the rich inner experience, and try to codify it in a graph with data is absurd.
As opposed to what? Just calling it fuzzy words? How does that help us understand
That's such an out, Michael. That's such an out. Use the words fuzzy, use the words woo-woo, and you're out of the argument.
I'll give you a technical explanation. When you talk about the observer effect and the uncertainty principle, this is how subatomic particles are altered by looking at them, by bombarding them with light, for example, because they're so small. And so you look at it or you don't look at it, and that changes the nature of what you're looking at. But the moon is really there whether you look at it or not. It doesn't apply to the macro world.
In the absence of a conscious entity, the moon remains a radically ambiguous and ceaselessly flowing quantum soup.
Deepak, that is...
That you have to have a conscious being.
The moon?
Yes.
Okay, listen to the sounds.
You have been... let's just say, dismissive of what Deepak has said thus far about the notion that there is something more than this. How can you be so sure that there isn't? And I know it's hard to prove a negative, if not impossible. But give me some evidence to support your contention that this is it.
Well, for example, I can't prove that there isn't something else that I don't know that there isn't. Huh? I mean, it's like the difference between something invisible and something non-existent. Well, it's zero and we can't study it. But if you take something specific like Gene's excellent comment there, we actually have a pretty good scientific understanding now based on evolutionary theory and evolutionary psychology that if you expand the circle of sentiments to include other people as honorary members of your tribe, you're less likely to kill them. And so, like, for example, tried and true game theory kind of data in the real world of opening up economic borders, you're less likely to bomb countries that make your cars and computers. That's a form of trade that makes you feel like somebody else is an honorary member of your tribe. Well, that has very deep evolutionary reasons that we've now come to understand in just the last few decades by applying the methods of science to something with a real social consequences. And we can derive that from data and tests and game theory models and so forth. So just in terms of what we can operationally define carefully so that we're all talking about the same thing and then go measure it or test it or experiment with it or try it. I mean, one of the great things about democracy, liberal democracy, it's kind of a scientific experiment. Let's try this, let's try that. This state has this taxation system, this one has that taxation system. It's like an experiment. And so I think what you described, Gene, as the expanding circle of sentiments to include women is a result of the Enlightenment experiment that let's try that. Let's see if that produces greater prosperity and wealth and happiness and joy for more people in more places, and it worked. And that's a rational, reasonable approach.
One thing I'd like to add to that is I think it's ironic to score women's rights for your side of the ledger here in this conversation, because there's been no greater obstacle to empowering women in human history than religion. Certainly the three monotheists. I mean, when you...
Sam, to my ear at least, neither Gene nor Deepak is advocating religion as you understand it.
That's true, and that's why I said what I said at the beginning. That the issue here, I mean, what kind of conversation should we have, and how will this conversation be construed by people in the audience, by people seeing this on television? And the reality is that the kind of talk and the kind of invocations of science that Deepak is offering here is received by a great number of people who believe a lot of unjustified, very myth-laden stuff that has been handed down to us.
You're making that statement without qualifying it, without giving any proof of it. Give me some proof that what I'm saying is what he says is woo-woo, just because he can't understand it.
Okay.
Every discipline has its vocabulary.
It's okay. If you're going to say that non-locality is an operable principle in neuroscience, that is woo-woo right now in neuroscience.
It's a principle in morphogenesis and differentiation. It's a principle in the workings of the pacemaker of your heart, where 100 pacemaker cells fire simultaneously, non-locally.
Saying it louder and relentlessly is not going to make it true. To answer your question, Dan, I want to get back to something that actually matters. The people, 90% of the people watching this on television will never have heard of non-locality, and if we could explain it to them, they're not going to care about it. They're worried about Jesus. They're worried about the collision with the Muslim world. They're worried about gay marriage. I mean, this is religion talk, and we're talking about the future of God. Now,
That's the past of God. Right?
Okay, so I'm happy to move on from that, but let's first acknowledge that that's the context. That's why we're having this conversation. The reason why we're talking about God is for the last 4,000 years, people have been handing books to their children saying, all these other books were written by people, but this book is a magic book. It could not possibly have been written by a human being.
I think...
And so now we're here talking about God and the future of God.
You think that's the past of God, and what is
I
the
think
future?
we can comfortably say that what Sam is talking about, one reason we are having this conversation is that this conversation will lead to other conversations which can say, been there, done that. Let's move on. And the future of God is to understand how a new understanding of science, a new understanding of the perennial wisdom traditions, otherwise called woo-woo, actually can lead to more compassion, to more love, to more kindness, to more tolerance, to more peace, to more insight, to more inspiration, to more creativity. So we become the conscious beings through which the universe will take its next leap in evolution. That's the future.
What sounds so bad about that future?
Well, but all of that is good. You should be doing those things anyway, whether or not there's a God or a great spirit or a non-locality.
And related to that, and that's a very good point. But what we find is that I tends to tend to thou more than I attends to it. And it's that whole question of having that personal I-thou relationship. I once studied with Martin Buber, who was, by the way, this tall and his beard was that long. And he talked about this sense of personal relationship being dynamic in the spiritual experience. Now, at the same time, what we find, it's fascinating, we are living in the time in which we sit zazen, we flirt with Sufism and Buddhism and its many, many different ideologies. And is this cafeteria religion, or is it people finding in the great repast of spiritual knowings, the wisdom traditions of many places, finding their own place, slowly but surely, in their own spiritual life?
Okay, but Gene, so that scheme, I agree with you about that scheme. There are many people having these remarkable experiences in every traditional context. That, in and of itself, proves that all of these religions are wrong. All of these religions claim their exclusive validity. And the fact that you have Christians having deep experiences of peace, and you have Muslims, and you have atheists, and you have Buddhists, it proves that there's a deeper principle. that should be talked about in a non-sectarian way that is not held hostage by Iron Age literature. I mean, that... Okay,
No, that's a very important point.
We need a scientific discourse on the possibilities of human well-being.
Sure.
And you can get as esoteric as you want there. You can talk about self-transcendence. You can talk about the ego being an illusion. You can ask, what is the relationship between consciousness and the rest of the physical world? And the truth is, when you get out to some of those fringe areas, you are getting to an area of real scientific ignorance. And the first thing you want to do in the spirit of intellectual honesty is admit ignorance, not claim that you, by closing your eyes, can realize your identity with the entire cosmos and the origin of you go get before the Big Bang with your unguarded intuitions. I mean, that's not how you discover what happened.
And it's also who you and I have been talking to, who will give very different perspectives on this. I think the big issue here in the future of God is that the reset button of history has been hit, and that we are in times such as we have never had before. And that in such times, I am finding people moving to a sense of radical empathy, not just with others' sensibilities and points of view, without which we will perish, you see, and you take a very different point of view, but that we are also, I think, expanding our sensibility of what we have called transcendence, grace, love, compassion. And as we do this, I think that there is being created in the world and time today a very unique and emergent spirituality, and with it a new story. I mean, that's what I have to hold to in the work that I do around the world, that there's a new story. I mean, let's take myth, for example. Now, I use myth differently than superstition. I think that a myth is something that never was, but is always happening. It's almost like the coded DNA of the human mind-brain system. And I travel to countries where I see the stories changing. As, for example, I was in India, and they were showing that great, the Ramayana, about, it's the great core story of India. And as we watched, the people came in, they tied up their water buffalo, they sat down, and here was the story of Rama and Sita being rescued. And the old Brahmin lady sitting next to me, she said, "Oh, I don't like Princess Sita. She's much too passive. We women in India, we're much stronger than that. We have to change the story." And I said, "Madam, the story is at least 3,000 years old." She said, "All the more reason why we have to change it. My name is Sita. My husband's name is Rama. He's a lazy bun. Anything happened, I'd have to rescue him." And I was watching the changing of the story in its mythic structure. The story is moving, I believe, from my experience around the world. I think it's moving to men and women together as part of the heroic journey. I think it's moving to people in many, many different cultures, and it is about the saving, if you will, of this beautiful planet in this, its most critical moment in human history. And that's the new story.
Gene, you know that nowhere in human discourse is there a greater impediment to changing the story than in religion. I mean, the story doesn't change. The Ramayana is not going to get rewritten based on that conversation.
You're talking about cultural mythology, not religion.
I'm talking about the Bible, the Quran.
That's all cultural mythology.
The organizing doctrines by which 99% of the people on earth who call themselves religious
Still the past.
Lives.
We have the internet. We have ABC News. We can change that conversation.
Yeah, that is the purpose of conversations like this. But it seems to me that if you want to move forward and reinvent God and actually have it be relevant to people and have your word God, I mean, I don't know why you'd be tempted to use the word God. If in
Generation,
fact you
organization, delivery.
Please. It seems to me that you are happily being misunderstood in your use of the word God. You know that
actually sad
that vast numbers of people care about God for a multiplicity of reasons, most of which you don't want to defend on this stage. But why use the word God? Why not just talk about
I just told you it's an acronym.
No. Deepak.
Well, I have to say, sorry for being so combative. That was because of Michael Shermer, but I actually agree. I actually agree with almost everything you've said, Sam. I have no disagreement with the deeper truth that you're hinting at. I'm just saying is that this conversation needs to take place in a setting such as this, where it can lead to other conversations so that this is not a debate but a dialectic where through these contradictory points of view we arrive at a greater truth.
Okay. But you are carrying around a tremendous amount of ballast from the past, and you are describing it as somehow necessary equipment. So, for instance, you talked about these great wisdom traditions that he is so callously dismissed out of his own ignorance. You go to these great wisdom traditions, right? And you consult. I mean, and you're talking about changing the story. And so, what does it mean to change the story in Islam? Let's just talk about facts. You open the Quran. In the 4th chapter, it says disobedient wives should be whipped by their husbands. Okay, so this is what
it says that in the Old Testament, all kinds of things. It says that
absolutely
in
does.
the Hindu book
Deepak, I'm just picking Islam as an example.
Why? It's true of all religions.
Okay, then I can pick Judaism. Would you be more comfortable if I pick Judaism as an example? It's the same. Yes, all of these books are litanies of barbarous practices. But the point is that the way Muslims are now constrained to change the story is they can't change the Quran. The Quran is the perfect word of the creator of the universe. They have to parse the word whipped, and the most enlightened of them have to say things like, well, it doesn't actually mean you take out the bullwhip and you whip her. It could be a kind of a ceremonial kind of patting, just a brief chastisement that doesn't actually hurt. And so you get a range, but nowhere in that range do you get real equity and real compassion and real understanding between the sexes. And to get that, you have to admit, okay, this is barbarous nonsense that we should just disregard. And religion doesn't give you the tools to do that. And God talk is either profoundly misleading or unhelpful, or it's just part of the problem.
So to your minds, is there any future of God that you could be comfortable with? A God, say, defined the way Deepak defines it.
Well, so he's sort of redefining it in his own particular way, in which everybody would have to agree. And then, I guess my point is, why hinge it to all the woo-woo stuff? Why hinge it to things that are just fuzzy words? We can actually get right down to understanding what's going on with things like compassion and emotion.
Science does not explain why we're here. It doesn't answer a lot of the big questions.
Oh, okay, but that doesn't mean it doesn't mean that we can't at least try to understand. I mean, the whole point of science is to try to get down and drill in and figure out what's going on. So we can use words like, it'd be better if we were all compassionate and loving to one another and so on. Of course, who would disagree? But what we want to know as scientists is, well, how do you actually implement that? What are the sorts of things we can do that increase that in people? Well, we have to understand what's going on when somebody has affections for somebody else. So, for example, if you have an exchange with another human, a stranger, in which you give them something and they give you something back and it's a positive thing, there's a little spike in oxytocin. Oxytocin is an attachment hormone discovered with nursing mothers and then expanded to it turns out anytime you touch somebody else, there's a little oxytocin there. So anything we can do to increase oxytocin is a good thing, and that makes people like each other. So there, I've not taken anything away from the beauty of love and the emotional appreciation, but we now have an understanding of the mechanics of it, and therefore you can structure some kind of social system in which there's more of that, not spraying it in the air, but actually having people exchange things in a positive way, like trade, increases oxytocin, and there's nothing wrong with knowing that. It doesn't take anything away from the story.
I'm not sure how I know this, but I think Deepak wants to say something.
Oxytocin is not love. Oxytocin is the measurement of love in a laboratory.
No.
Just like
You're
H2O,
no.
knowing the formula H2O is not the experience of water.
Deepak,
Okay?
this experiment has been run.
I know it has been run. What does it prove, though?
The control is that you give oxytocin to people, and then they become
Because
more
both
generous.
oxytocin and the experience of love are interdependent.
This is semantic.
It's not a causal relationship. Is not the same thing as correlation.
Deepak,
You know?
there are different levels
If
of
I go to a
describing
picnic
ourselves.
and there are ants all the time, that doesn't mean ants cause the picnic.
Okay, let me just explain the experiment. So, two people in a game set.
I know the experiment,
but
Michael.
Wait, I have to say it. Two people.
This is the kind of woo-woo you guys promote
No.
to prove
is-
your
yeah.
so-called science.
I don't know the
Zoo is
experiment, so let
controlled
him tell the
experiment.
experiment.
Yeah, let me
Okay.
Okay, so You have two people in an exchange game, and they make an offer to each other. And if it's fairly equitable and generous, they feel good about each other. You draw their blood, and there's a spike in oxytocin. Now, is that because oxytocin is the result of the positive interaction, or is it the cause? So the control was you give them a little, before the experiment, you give them a little hit of oxytocin with a nose spray. It's done to induce labor in pregnant women. And Paul Zak did this research, and sure enough, any subjects that got a spike in oxytocin from the nose spray were more generous than those that didn't get the spike.
But if I said I love you and it meant something to you, you would also release oxytocin.
Yeah.
So does the thought create the molecule, or the molecule create the thought? Are they simultaneous expressions of a deeper, transcendent reality that we are inseparable?
Ask him.
Can I just jump in here? All right. Okay, well, I think we should wander off the specifics of oxytocin. He's just described an experiment where you can actually answer that question. If I give you a shot of oxytocin and it changes your level of trust, then it's not just mere correlation. I mean, we've run it both ways. So
but
that's
I can increase trust, and it can generate oxytocin too.
But if trust is just the brain in one state, then you have the brain influencing its future states. You haven't gotten out of the brain and got do we have souls or some that our mind is somehow independent of the brain that will lift off the brain at death and go elsewhere? Is that
I believe there's a transcendent core consciousness that is comprised of meanings, context, relationships, archetypal ideas that recycles itself, just like everything else recycles itself.
So it's in no sense a product of the brain.
It's no sense a product of the brain, and our whole endeavor in spiritual discipline is to actually go beyond that personal consciousness, that ego consciousness, so we can identify with that transcendent reality, which is the source of space, time, energy, and everything else that exists.
Okay, so you put a lot on the table. So Deepak just said some very seems a strange word to use, but some concrete things that science can criticize. Okay, you just said that consciousness and mind are...
I didn't say consciousness and mind. I said mind is a product of consciousness.
Okay, but this subjectivity is independent of the objectivity of the brain.
There is a subjectivity which is independent of objects. But there's subjectivity which is subjectivity of itself. When you're looking at the brain for consciousness, you're not looking at consciousness. You're looking at synaptic firings. In fact, it is your consciousness that is looking at those synaptic firings.
All right. Let's just keep that in view. All right. Now, you've said there are two things that an incomplete science of consciousness and the mind should want to say about that. One is that having an experience of undivided consciousness does not tell you what consciousness really is or what its relationship to the brain really is. There's nothing about introspection that leads you to sense that your subjectivity is at all dependent or even related to voltage changes and chemical interactions going on inside your head. Okay, you can feel, you can drop acid, you can meditate for a year, you can do whatever you want to perturb your nervous system. You can feel yourself to be one with the universe, and at no point in that transformation do you get a glimpse that there's 100 trillion neurons in your head or synapses in your head that are doing anything.
It's called binding.
No, it's not. It's called absolute subjective ignorance of what's actually going on outside your consciousness.
You're
Deepak,
dismissive of subjective experience.
I'm not remotely dismissive of it.
To poetry, to music, to art. So dismissive of subjectivity. I'm saying that the whole universe is imbued with subjectivity.
There's nothing more important than subjectivity. It's all we could possibly care about. The fabric of our experience, the changes in our conscious experience, are all we care about. And they have some relation to the physical universe.
Absolutely.
Okay, now the question is...
They give rise to the physical universe.
Okay, that is a statement of metaphysics that is totally unjustified and cannot possibly be justified.
That's why it's a statement of metaphysics, not of physics.
No, metaphysical statements also have to be justified, as it turns out.
Metaphysics statements come from subjective experiences.
All right, you're starting to lose me a little bit. I've let it go. I've let it go, but let's rein it back in. I'm just curious with you tonight. I tried to go down this road with you before, but you didn't really bite, so I'm going to try it again. Are you, I think the question that a lot of people have for guys like you, atheists, agnostics, is are you comfortable with not, you must be therefore comfortable with not knowing the answers to big questions, or you have some sort of confidence that there is nothing more that most other people don't have?
Well, twofold. One, yes, by temperament, I'm comfortable not knowing the big answers to the big questions. It's okay to say, I don't know. And just live with it. Believe it or not, that's okay. And
you believe that when Deepak comes up with theories that you would call woo-woo, that he is just simply at his core, whether he knows it or not, uncomfortable not knowing?
Well, I'm not sure about that. I think he likes to layer on the language of science because it seems to ground it in something a little more concrete than just woo. And what we're saying here is that you don't need to do that. You don't need to hinge it to all this jargon, because values like love and tolerance for differences and expanding the circle of sentiments to include more people, those are values that stand in and of themselves, because people have value as an end in themselves, not as a means to an end. And that's an enlightenment value that's derived from scientific and reason and rational principles for the last 500 years. And you don't have to take all of that layer and put it on there that most people wouldn't understand anyway, and it just confuses things.
Is your rock-solid certitude about there not being a God in and of itself a form of orthodoxy?
Well, I'm not rock solid that there is no God. I would be surprised at this point, I have to say. If it was anything like Yahweh, I'd be shocked. But I actually have a little thing I would say if it turned out to be the case, what I would say standing there at the pearly gates.
All right, what is it?
Oh, well, I mean, first of all, it would be, you gave me this brain in your own image that it reasons and doubts and so on, and so I applied it to you. And so, in any case, why does belief matter? Shouldn't it matter more how you comport yourself in life and how you treat other people? And
but Deepak, and I'll get you just 1 second. But Deepak's point is that molecules don't feel compassion.
Right.
That ethics and love and compassion and empathy are all, and you tell me if I'm wrong here, evidence that can be marshaled in support of an argument for divine.
It is impossible, and Roger Penrose and John Searle would substantiate this. It is impossible for a physical system, no matter how complex it is, to process meaning, to process creativity, to process purpose, to process even, you can map it out, you can show the molecules there, but it is impossible for a physical system to feel those qualities.
Okay, that's simply not true. It's what is true to say is that we don't understand how that is being accomplished, and we don't, and even I'll give you even more than that. We don't understand what the relationship between consciousness and matter is. Now, for instance, if electrons,
I'll grant you that, by the way, what you just corrected me on.
So but it's not. There's no reason. It gets you nothing to say it's impossible in science.
Well, I'm saying that very prominent researchers like John Searle and Roger Penrose have made those explicit statements.
Okay, but they're in a much larger conversation. They have more detractors than could fit in this hall. These are areas of genuine scientific uncertainty. But what is obvious is that the way to clarify this domain is not to pretend to know things you don't know.
Well, I'm sorry.
And you're saying. I want to bring Gene in.
Yeah, I just want to say I'm sorry if I gave the impression that I don't know, that I pretend to know things that I don't know. I'm just offering a possible hypothesis. That's why we're calling it the future of God. And I stand corrected.
Okay, so when you say,
I'd like to talk about this.
If I could just tie him down to this one statement, though, because this seems like new information. Okay. If you're saying that when you say we are on a continuum, the consciousness that I experience in myself is the creator of the universe, which you said about 5 minutes ago.
You see, creator is a very anthropomorphic...
Okay, I just want, is that however you said it, is that a hypothesis? Or because you said it as just a blanket assertion, this is a fact
I think
that I'm ignorant of.
See, there are three ways of knowing. One is through empirical observation, what we call the eyes of the flesh. Then there's a deeper knowing, comes from the eyes of the mind. If I want to understand the theorem of Pythagoras, it's activity of the mind. Why does mathematics, for example, describe so precisely the activity of nature? It's one of the most astounding puzzles of the universe. And then there is a deeper knowing, which is the eyes of the soul. You know, what's his name? William Blake said, we are led to believe a lie when we see with and not through the eye that was born in a night to perish in the night while the soul slept in beams of light. So what I'm saying is,
but that's why William Blake is not a great scientist.
Of knowing. We need a synthesis of knowing which combines empirical observation, a deeper knowing that comes from the mind and from the soul.
But I want to hear.
I think this kind of conversation is perhaps footnotes or prelude to the larger conversation of this field of mind in which people are coming into a dramatic, dynamic sense of the ways in which we relate to and are related to by the world, which ultimately I think is not just the noosphere, but is the ground and seat of being of consciousness itself.
The theosphere.
The theosphere.
The theosphere.
I'm seeing profoundly skeptical looks on both of your faces.
Where's the audience?
Do we have a theospheric sensitivity machine that we can measure this by? I mean, we have the internet. I mean, we can speak metaphorically or poetically about the power of the internet and how we're all interconnected. Yeah. But we all know that it really does come right down to cables and wireless devices, and you got to have a laptop and a computer and a modem. There's still a mechanics underneath it. So to speak metaphorically is okay as long as you recognize in the sphere of literature and poetry, that's what you do.
Yeah, but a man's reach must exceed his grasp. Or what's a metaphor?
Well, a metaphor is literally moving something from here to here in the
right,
Greek,
but
and
I
so
think
that's just helping us understand.
Permit me, and you tell me if I'm wrong, but I think the argument that she was trying to make there is that your brand of skepticism is the death of creativity, the death of idealism. Well, you're clamping down on...
All right. Let me address that, because Deepak has said this as well. So the word skeptic has gotten a bit of a tarnished name. It isn't anything special. It's just science. It's just a critical approach to claims. Most claims that most people make are just bunk. They are. You have to have some kind of method to find out if it's real or if it's not. So, and everybody knows this already. The FDA doesn't just approve any old drug that anybody says, I think it cures cancer or AIDS or whatever. You actually have to go through a methodology before they approve it. And all we're saying is that before you use words like Deepak does, let's define them carefully and see if there's actually any evidence. Is there data for this or not? Before we just hook ourselves to it as a belief system. And so it's really just an approach to claims. All scientists are skeptics. They just have to be, because there's so many goofy ideas out there, most of which are not true.
Michael has said, I believe this is a direct quote, that when asked what is belief, you've said it's just brain chemistry.
Yeah, that's right. Brain chemistry. Yeah. I mean, we can track exactly this is what Sam does. The magnet, the big MRI at UCLA, tracks what's going on in the brain when people form beliefs about things. That doesn't take away in any way the power of belief, the social construction of belief, and how it drives behaviors. All we want to know is try to understand. I don't think you...
We're not disagreeing with them. Yeah. Belief has a brain chemistry to it. There's no question about it.
Right, but you would argue that it's not just that.
I have never defended belief. I started out by saying that belief is a cover-up for insecurity.
Forget about belief. Just human experience is... everything is contained in what you mean by just. Okay, does just mean you're taking all of the meaning out of life and just deflating us to a puddle of randomly aggregated proteins that have nothing of what interests a human being through the course of his or her life? And many people assume that a completed scientific understanding of ourselves would somehow amount to that we're just atoms in some temporary arrangement, and everything that we love out of life, including love, it can't be captured by that. And that's just not what science is.
Would you agree, and I think you're almost saying it, that nothing but, to say something nothing but is never true. It's always both and plus much, much more. And I think we're looking at what is the much, much more.
Yeah,
when
but what you're tending to do with
arenas.
the much, much more, I think, is profoundly misleading.
Yes.
I mean, that's the rub here.
Say that again, I'm sorry.
He says what you're tending to do with the much, much more is profoundly misleading.
And worse than that, and I'm not just talking about you, I'm talking about people, worse than that, it is on a continuum with what the really religiously infatuated and dogmatic are doing, and because you're using the same words.
Scientifically dogmatic and infatuated.
But like that move itself is, I mean, so you can say, you can talk about scientific fundamentalism as the corollary of religious fundamentalism. That's just a trick with words. There is no scientific fundamentalism that is analogous to religious fundamentalism. But that's a separate issue.
I think. But by the way,
if I could just, do you believe the fact that you use words like God and faith with such enthusiasm puts you you are the shade under which all of these really barbarous forms of religiosity still relax and luxuriate and thrive because you. And I don't mean you personally, I mean religious liberals, moderates, New Age types who still want to talk about God and faith and not differentiate what they're saying from the rest of God talk, which is really what is shaping our conversation about religion in this country and this world.
Of course, you write very beautifully about that, about the fact of religious moderates, as you call them, being coveralls for a whole lot of messy stuff. Okay,
yeah.
I mean, you write about that. And I don't know that we're talking about these kinds of folk. I think we're trying to talk about what is the future of, if you want to say it's religion, future of God, future of spirituality, as a result of what is coming in through traditional and the new science, what is coming in through education, what is coming in through the fact that I said the world mind is taking a walk with itself. What is it going to start to look like? What would you like it to look like? Because spirituality is not going to go away. I think you'll agree about that. And, however brilliant your arguments are, they are not going to convince people who have a passionate entheosiasmos, being filled with the enthusiasm of the sense of God, because I personally believe it is given to us as part of our human condition. What I'm not hearing here, and I really want to hear, and perhaps we'll get to it with the questions, is what does a robust faith in our human condition, which may or may not include our spiritual beliefs, really begin to look like?
A religion which is devoid of authentic spiritual experience will become diabolical, with increasing weapons of mass destruction, weapons of biological warfare, nuclear bombs, but a spirituality-imbued science will actually lead to science healing the ecosystem, the restoration of species, social justice, and the removing of poverty. So I think it's very important to bring a deep spiritual knowing of inseparability, love, compassion, kindness, and peace into our science.
Here's an example. When Mohammed Atta flew the plane into the World Trade Center building, I'm firmly convinced he believed in love and compassion and spirituality and commitment to his belief.
His own
of
tribe.
Course, Deepak, that's
Only
what everybody
for his own
does.
Tribe, but that's not spirituality.
Yes, well, for him it is
a domain of awareness where we go beyond our tribal identity and experience our universality. Okay. That's the fundamental definition of spirituality.
Well, for you, and if you can convince suicide bombers and religious extremists of
Talking
that,
about the future.
Okay, all right.
But
Well,
if that was would you be comfortable with the future he's painting?
Well, of course, it's much better than what we've got. But why all the jargon?
See, when you don't understand the language of a particular school of thought, you call it woo-woo.
No, but you're using it in a way that nobody else uses it.
My patients would think we were speaking woo-woo because we spoke Latin words. You don't understand the language of of geology or astronomy, so you're equally at liberty to call it woo-woo. I am engaged in dialogue with people of real science. Last week, I had a conference at my center called Sages and Scientists, where I had Hans-Peter Duer, who was a colleague and student of Werner Heisenberg, and we engaged in this science, this kind of dialogue, and he did not call it woo-woo.
I have a question. It concerns near-death experiences, but when you read the Old Testament in the ancient Hebrew, it discusses God as being light, and then Jesus said that we were made in God's image. So I'm wondering if that means that the soul was light. And if so, when you look at near-death experiences, people talk about going into the light. Does the light leave the body? And if so, is that the energy structure of the body that before the brain and the body decays to a point that it can't be resuscitated, is still communicating with the body via like bioentanglement, for lack of a better word? Is that something that is a really real experience that could one day be measured by science, but also point to the validity of the intuitive truth of certain wisdom, traditions, or religions?
First of all, in the word itself, near death. They're not dead. They're near dead. There's a very big difference there. And you can replicate these in the lab. You can put on Michael Persiger's God helmet that bombards the temporal lobes with electromagnetic fields, and people have out-of-body near-death experiences right there in his room. You can do it through oxygen deprivation by accelerating people in a centrifuge. These are pilots. Over half of them, when they accelerate up to where they pass out, they have out-of-body near-death experiences. They see the light at the end of the tunnel. They go through the tunnel and so on. You can see the videotape. They're just sitting there drooling. They're out. And, of course, you can do this through sleep deprivation, through extreme environments. Arctic climbers, Arctic explorers, mountain climbers, solo sailors have these kinds of out-of-body near-death sense-presence experiences under extreme environmental conditions. So those three lines of evidence tell us it's in the brain, not outside of it.
I would say that near-death experiences neither prove nor disprove anything. You know, of course, there's damage to the brain, but the brain is also a localizing device. And in the absence of brain, you can still have a consciousness which has no thought. You can still have a consciousness which is non-local, which is awareness in itself. So near-death experiences neither prove nor anything or disprove anything. Of course, there has got to be a biological correlate of the experience. And ischemia, brain damage, etc. also proves that. On the other hand, there are people with extensive brain damage who have profound scientific and musical epiphanies.
What's your name?
Leonard Mladinov.
And so, Leonard, you are a quantum physicist?
I'm a theoretical physicist, and I'm also writing a book with Stephen Hawking, so I could comment on the God question with Stephen Hawking.
So, in the spirit of our no comments, just questions, what's your question? Mm-hmm. And to whom? I'll hold the mic.
Oh, you hold the mic, all right. That means it really has to be a question, okay.
Right, this is my form of
This would be to Deepak to say, would you like to have a short course in quantum mechanics sometime so that we can straighten out your slightly misuse of quantum notation?
Thank you, Leonard.
I would be honored, sir, and I accept your offer with great gratitude. And I would like to be educated so I can be clearer in my dialogue. By the way, today is Einstein's birthday, so we are at a very fitting place. And it just occurred to me, 3.14 is the approximation of the first approximation of pi, which refers to infinity. So as long as your quantum physics explanations help me understand infinity, I would be honored.
That would be good, but we'll have to keep it local, though. I don't think we can make it non-local.
No, but
can I bother you for just a second? What is it?
Sir, do you, sir, believe in the infinite?
I believe I understand to some extent the concept of infinity. I'm not sure what it means to believe in the infinite.
Okay, do you think that your mathematics requires the infinite to explain things that you explain to people?
We do use the concept of infinity quite a lot.
Thank you.
We do. You're welcome.
What is it about Deepak's use of quantum physics that bothers you?
The term non-local, the use was not correct, and the correlations of the, I don't know, the pacemaker and the different electrical things going on.
I happen to disagree, by the way.
Oh, I assume you did since you said that.
You know, you're in college. I happen to disagree.
I would love to. I'd love to talk about it.
I think consciousness is non-local.
I'm sorry?
I think consciousness is non-local.
Conscious death?
Consciousness.
Oh.
Is non-local.
Yeah, you know, I've never really run across a definition of consciousness that I understood. So maybe you could teach me something, and I can.
A superposition of possibilities.
Okay. Well, all right. I know what each of those words means. I still don't think I know.
I'm right now talking to a conscious being.
I'm sorry?
I'm speaking to a conscious being.
I hope so.
Even though the conscious being is pretending to be a physicist.
Is pretending?
Pretending means pretending in the larger context. You are an infinite being who's taken on the identity of a physicist in space and time.
Deepak, how can there be a conversation with someone like Michael or Sam that can have a constructive outcome for those of us who are intensely curious about why we're here and what we're supposed to do?
And I would like to have the conversation if he stops using the cop-out word, woo-woo. That's a cop-out, okay? But
I suspect
yes,
Alberto is disappointed.
If I was having a conversation with Michael, I would say, help me, dear scientists, to understand why we have this deep yearning. Why do we have this deep longing to understand the nature of the beginnings of the universe? Why do we have this deep yearning and longing to understand ourselves? Help me. If you can help me as a scientist to explain why this is built into the scheme of evolution, or does evolution have to do anything, I am here to be enlightened.
Sam, what do you say to that?
Well, I think it's we don't all have this deep yearning. I mean, that's rather obvious. If you took the 100,000 people on planet Earth at this moment who felt this deep yearning to understand our place in the universe most acutely, and you dispatch them, we would be left without a lot of people thinking about the origins of the universe in any real sense.
What do you think people are doing on Sunday morning all over this country?
What was that?
What are people doing on Sunday mornings at 11 o'clock all over this country? They're thinking about that issue.
They're not thinking about, I mean, cosmology is not their concern.
Well, they might not call it cosmology, but they are thinking about why we're here and what we're supposed to do.
I'm sorry,
Deepak, let me just finish. On Sunday morning,
right,
or Friday afternoon, or Friday night, depending on when you worship, whether you want to call it cosmology, whatever you want to call it, people are there to ask the basic questions. Who are we? Why are we here? What are we supposed to be doing?
I was responding to what Deepak was saying.
But I think that's what he was saying.
People want to be happy. They know the difference between happiness and suffering. They want to feel a part of a community. They want to feel the best they've ever felt and better than they've ever felt. And they constantly notice that life makes that difficult. And our spiritual traditions are a response to that circumstance. And our beliefs, the beliefs that console us about what happens after death, are obviously a response to that circumstance. I mean, your child dies. What you're immediately confronted with is, what can I now do to not suffer this way for the rest of my life? And one thing people have found to do is tell each other a story that death is an illusion, that we all get together at the right hand of Jesus after we die. That does the trick for a lot of people, and people are mightily attached to that story. But that story is really both in its products and in the way of getting there, the antithesis of the scientific frame of mind. And we just can't conflate them. And we have to notice when we're lying to ourselves and when we're lying to our children. And we have to notice that there's a liability to pretending to know things we don't know.
A long time ago, religion made a pact with science with Mr. Descartes, I guess his name was. And where he didn't want to be burnt at the stake, so he agreed with religion that religion would take over the spiritual aspect and questions regarding, God or the higher being, and science would relegate itself to the physical. My question is, when is science going to forget Descartes and start focusing on, what creates evil, for instance, and those things that have been relegated to religion? Why doesn't science now start focusing in that direction so that we can get a clearer picture of things?
Yeah. Well,
Bravo, Carmela. Michael, go ahead.
Of course, I described a little bit about in the last 20 years or so, there's been a concerted effort on the part of neuroscientists to understand what's going on in the brain with things like evil. But this goes back to the 60s with Milgram's shock experiment and Zimbardo's basement prison experiment and so on. These are attempts to get a scientific understanding of why people do bad things, why they do evil things. So I think we're right there with you. These are just harder problems to solve because there's so many more variables and degrees of freedom of the components in the formula because there's people in social interactions. And so, in a way, Deepak, I'm with you on there's more than just the neurons, of course. There's higher order, there's binding, there's emergent self-organized properties of complex systems, and the higher up you go from neurons all the way up to people in an economy or a political system, wow, is that complex. This is a really hard problem. So we need to really apply science, exactly like you suggest.
But on this point of evil, sometimes there's not more than just the neurons, because we know, for instance, that the brains of psychopaths are damaged in ways that we're now increasingly understanding. People are scanning the brains of people who rate very highly on the psychopathy scale. But the classically evil people, the people who don't feel empathy for their victims, who like torturing and killing people. This is something we're increasingly understanding at the level of the brain, and we know the various regions of the frontal lobe that have characteristic pathology in psychopaths, and no doubt at some point we'll understand that in much greater detail. Now, there are many different, that doesn't mean evil is really just this region of the brain damaged. There's much more that can be said about human evil, but it has neural correlates, and if you damage the part of the brain that mediates feelings of empathy, that person won't feel empathy anymore. And that is a causal fact, which we are now in a position to appreciate.
Thank you, Sam. What's your name?
My name is Elliot. I'm from Jamaica. I was sick for 4 years. I could not talk. Just being connected. I've listened to Deepak Chopra's CDs my first time meeting him. Magical Mind, Magical Body. And they talk about meditation. If you meditate, it will help you to regain that consciousness. And I did it. These are pictures of when my eyes was closed down. I had to use my hands to open my eyes, and the words would not come out my mouth. And having that experience with the unknown, it's been 2 years now going on since I'm able to talk again and open my eyes without no medication or anything. Just that connection with the unknown.
And so what would you say, how can we frame that as a question?
No, well, what I'm saying is that the unknown that Deepak talked about, it's real. We all experience it, but you have to have that experience for yourself. And to have that experience, letting go of judgments and resentments will get you in a closer connection to having that experience with the unknown.
Thank you.
And a lot of people are not aware of the unknown.
Well said. Thank you. Thank you very much. So Michael and Sam, how do you respond when you hear a testimonial like that?
Well, first let me say I didn't hear it in every detail, but I think I got the sense of it. He was saying he was greatly helped by Deepak's techniques of meditation? Or? Correct. Okay. Well,
that he was very sick and that Deepak's meditation helped him.
Well, there's no question that there's if the mind is just what the brain is doing, and again, I say if, I mean, it's possible that there's more to be said about the mind, but if it is just the brain, what the brain is doing, well, then there's no mystery that there's a mind-brain relationship, because it's all the body. So neurophysiology is affecting the functioning of the body on many levels. It's affecting the immune system. stress affects the brain, genes are transcribed in response to stress. I mean, all of this is a system. And some people want to argue that the system is not enough to account for human experience, but the science is very much unwritten and open-ended on that subject, and we simply don't know all the details. But there's no question people have remarkable experiences practicing meditation, changing their moment-to-moment thoughts about themselves. And this, if this is what the brain is doing, and there are many reasons to think that it is what the brain is doing, it of course has changes reflected.
So are you saying it's the unknown? But it's not necessarily the divine.
None of that diminishes. I mean, for instance, the placebo effect. We know the placebo effect for many conditions is really robust. I mean, you can give someone a pill that has absolutely no medical potential in it at all, and they will feel much better. And so it's possible to have one's expectation of medicine really transform the way one feels.
And changing biology.
Okay, so yeah, that's a potential of the human mind, and it is a potential of the human brain, and we need to understand that. But none of that requires that we pretend to know things we don't know.
Thank you. What's your question?
My name is Scott. Actually, and this is meant to be an extremely respectful follow-up to Elliot, but the question is for Deepak, and that's that. How much do you feel, Deepak, that the extremely lucrative nature of spirituality financially arrests our ability to take into account science in terms of the origins of our universe? Thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, spirituality is not as lucrative as diabolical science. Diabolical science generates the greatest wealth in the world through the manufacture and trading of weapons of mass destruction. Diabolical science generates research grants that lead to biological warfare, internet hacking, and all the devastation that we are seeing in science. If Sam is a critic of religion, I would say that diabolical science has the capacity to actually destroy the world faster than any religion.
Sam, go ahead.
Because we still have ancient habits, and we have modern capacities.
Sam?
So true lucrative science will be the science that actually helps us heal the world.
Sam, what do you?
Well, again, this is it's a play on words. Whenever you're talking about scientific fundamentalism or diabolical science, we have a problem with technology. Much of our technology can be extremely destructive, and in the wrong hands, and rather often those hands are religious hands. It becomes incredibly dangerous. So we have people with 14th century worldviews who now have access to incredibly destructive technology.
Almost out of time.
But
so I'm gonna do my best.
this is the point to take on board. The remedy, there's such a thing as bad science. There's such a thing as scientific fraud. There's such a thing as incomplete science. The remedy for all of those things is more science and better science and further scientific discussion. It is never religion.
Thank you, Sam.
Hi, I'm Lucinda Yawn.
Who are you talking to on that phone?
Oh, nobody. But anyway.
The unknown?
The unknown, absolutely. Actually, I'm a very basic and practical person, so we're going to try to keep this basic and practical. I made the decision one day that I had the power to choose to be a person of compassion and kindness and courage. That was my choice to make. Now my question to both sides is how do we finally get people there? I really don't care. I want them to finally make that cognitive, meaningful decision that I am responsible to be a compassionate, caring person. It is my choice to make, my responsibility, my obligation to make it and act on it. So I don't care which side gets us there, but my question to each side is, what's your answer to how we get there?
Play moderator and pick somebody to answer that question.
I'll ask...
I guess Deepak's doing it. Go ahead.
think how you get there is how you got there, by self-reflection and by asking yourself, am I a conditioned response? Am I a bundle of conditioned reflexes and nerves that is being constantly triggered by people and circumstance into predictable outcomes, in which case you would be a machine? Or am I a conscious being that I can actually choose the actions I choose? Do I have free will? And that cannot come about unless you go within.
Michael Shermer, how would you answer that question?
Well, first of all, doing exactly what you just did, that's how you do it. You just stand up and say, let's all do this. I mean, that's how we get things going.
So, well, first of all, I'm really thankful to the Skeptic Society to bringing this perhaps the most engaging conversation on Caltech campus since I've been here. I just wish and request Deepak that if he could return every year so that we can all come and laugh together on laugh together. I didn't say laugh on Deepak. So there were two things. One was that Deepak mentioned that been there, done that when people brought up religion and the bad things which happened, like not progress in women, education, and atrocities, etc. So could Deepak and Jean say now that the religion of past, or the things, the whole organization of God of the past, it was on a bigger picture, perhaps bad or negative? And secondly, they mentioned that we want to bring all the people from art and music all together on the same platform so that we can all talk and learn about the unknown. I was just thinking, Deepak keeps bringing quantum mechanics, etc. If you want to do a quantum mechanics experiment, you need, high vacuum, really small structures, and very well-precise conditions. I don't know how a man sitting in a cave in Himalayas, he could possibly come up with that kind of a result or that observation and contribute to that discussion.
Deepak, what would you answer? His question basically is, was all religion, if it's been there, done that, was all religion in the past bad?
I think the religious experience was an extremely beautiful, lovely experience. It's the kind of experience that is the aha moment, even in science. It's transcendence, it's inspiration. But yes, then it got organized and we went to war. So I would say that organized religion has done a lot of damage. But on the other hand, organized religion has also done a lot of humanitarian work. And if you go across the world, you'll see that there are extremely religious people who have so-called religious beliefs that we would call cultural mythology, but they're doing extraordinary good work.
Is our existence an accident?
No. If it were truly just randomness and accident and chance, we wouldn't be here, for sure. There are self-organizing emergent properties within the cosmos, and evolution is one of them. So the random mixing up of genes, yeah, that's kind of accidental, but that isn't what evolution is. Evolution's in the selective process and cumulative selection of successful structures that leads to complex organisms. So there is something deeper. Again, we don't have to use fuzzy language to understand it. It's still part of science to say it's self-organized and emergent and have a very clear understanding of what that means.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Good question. What's your name?
My name is Cassie Yan, and organized religion is a reality of today. So my question is, what will happen to organized religion in the future?
Well, I don't think religion's going to go away anytime soon, but I do like to take a long time horizon. And that as we continue to expand the circle of sentiments and expand things like liberal democracies and market trade between peoples where, say, the internet, anybody can talk to anybody else anytime for free, they can exchange things without centralized control interfering, that's a good thing. And to the extent that religions get out of the way and let us do that, I think they may just fall into disuse. I was discouraged by the China Google thing. I thought the Google guys would get around that, but it may take a little bit longer than I.
Gene, what do you think is the future of organized religion?
Well, I think that most organizations are falling apart. We're in the biggest time of deconstruction that the world has ever seen. And I think it's going to go through a kind of morphing into a new way of being and doing. I would hope that there would be an undercurrent of an appreciation of a perennial and universal spirituality out of which these different ways and frames of seeing would then find richer and deeper ways of relating to the meaning of it all. And I think that when it is no longer the man on the cross or the man under the tree, or the man for that matter, who is the vehicle through which the enlightenment and the epiphany occurs, but I would love to see a great generalization of spiritual experience happening across the board, and as people move into the greatness of this experience, I think that the nature of religion itself will change. I'm looking for a democratization of spiritual experience.
Thank you, Gene. What's your name?
David Richardson, and my question is a bit of a follow-on to the last one, but is primarily directed towards Sam. Sam, from the perspective of a neuroscientist, and knowing what we know today about the hardwiring as well as the other structures in the brain, the neurochemistry, as to our inherent bias toward wanting a causal explanation for what we see and experience around us, whether God actually exists or not in any of the organized or unorganized discussions that we've had with God, don't you feel that a belief in God is, from a neurochemical or structural basis, inevitable?
Well, apparently not. I've got a sample of at least one that I'm pretty sure about.
You want to go back on him, Adam, on that? Or?
Yes, I'd say secondarily, based on our need for tribes and society, don't you feel that, again, the belief that there is no God is going to, from our own structured creation, not discussing what the cause of that creation was, but don't you feel that we're just biased in such a way that in society we will always have the belief in God as the major belief, and the belief that there is no God as a minor and presently not very vocal understanding?
Yeah, it's an interestingly provincial point of view. That we're in America, which is almost functionally a theocracy. But in Western Europe, your question actually wouldn't make sense right now. I mean, it is a massively secular part of the world, and you go to Scandinavia, it flips entirely. It's something like a majority, 60 to, depending on how you ask the question, 60 to 80% of people in Denmark, for instance, are atheists. I mean, they do not believe, they treat the God of Abraham the way we treat Zeus. And that is, just refresh the browser in your brain and realize that those are actually equivalent. And we are in a shocking circumstance where most people in our society are really worried about Zeus. And you pick up the New York Times tomorrow, and I guarantee you that the international section of the paper will more or less read like, what are the crazy Muslims doing today? But if you realize that what they're doing is on the basis of a belief that is just like a belief in the gods of Mount Olympus. I mean, imagine if you drawing cartoons of Hercules could get you killed.
I heard Deepak mention that there are deeper ways of knowing, and I get the impression that this is based on intuition and the subjective. And I'd like to know, if we don't use the objective scientific method, how do we distinguish what is true from what we simply want to be true?
What's your name?
Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah. Deepak, have at it.
I think science is based on a subject-object split. I'm the observer, and that's the observed. And it does extremely well based on the subject-object split. I am hoping that the truth will be found when we actually develop a science of consciousness that goes beyond the subject-object split, because after all, nature is one. Nature does not decide that this is the subject and that's the object. Nature says that both the subject and the object are my activity. So my prayer is that science will evolve to include consciousness in its evolution. I want to say that a science that does not diminish the richness of human experience to data on a graph and end up being so reductionism will be incomplete. It has to go to the next level. At the same time, I think a theology that is based on primitive ideas that were born in the Bronze and Iron Age are no longer relevant. So my hope is that this conversation on this wonderful location on the birthday of Einstein will say, how can we create a conversation between the Einsteins of the world and the sages of the world?
Sam?
Actually, I think I want to treat the question that was asked by the woman who asked about near-death experience and the use of the word light in the Old Testament. Because it seems to me really to come back to the books in terms of general relevance to world events. We are really prisoners of literature right now. We are constrained to talk either explicitly about these books or in some vague conformity to these books. And these books were written by people who every person in this room has more access to information and scientific knowledge and just what is now basic common sense than the authors of the Bible and the Quran. And in fact, there's not a person in this room who has ever met a person whose worldview is as narrow, just by the sheer time in which they appeared in history, as the worldviews of Abraham or Moses or Jesus or Muhammad. And until we grapple with that fact and honestly talk about honestly commit ourselves